This is Chapter 5, Sensation and Perception. This is a pretty interesting chapter. We'll be covering not only the sensory organs, but how they bring information in from our environment into the brain and how the brain interprets that information. While your textbook covers all 5 senses, for the sake of this audio lecture, we're going to be covering vision, audition, which is hearing, and also taste. At the end of this lecture, we'll talk a little bit about synesthesia, which is a combining of the senses. Unfortunately, this is one of those chapters that I think is much more fun if you are taking in a seated class. We do a lot of experiments, we do a lot of different sensory interaction types of activities in a seated class that unfortunately we can't do online. As we go through, I'll tell you about a couple of different websites that if you're interested you can check out that deal with some optical illusions, some different hearing exercises that we usually do in class as well that prove to be pretty interesting. Okay, here are definitions for sensation and perception. Sensation is the sense organ's detection of external physical stimulus and the transmission of information about this stimulus to the brain. Basically, how we interact with our environment and how we bring that information from our environment into our neural systems. Perception is the processing, organization, and interpretation of sensory signals in the brain. These processes result in an internal neural representation of the physical stimulus. So we have these things in our environment, we take them in, and then once they get processed in the brain, that's our sense of perception. 3 steps that are basic to all sensory systems are sensation, transduction, and perception. Basically, the sensation is just what we said, taking in stimulus energies from our environment. Transduction, the middle part, is getting that information in a neural signal from the environment to the brain. And then the perception is what happens when it gets to the brain, how we interpret it, how we organize, how we understand that information. Here's a great example from your textbook. There's a physical stimulus somewhere in your environment. In this example, it's a traffic light. You're in your car, you come up to a light, it's red, you stop, and then when the traffic light turns green, light waves from that green signal come into your environment. The sensation is when those light waves are detected by the sensory receptors into the driver's eyes. We're going to talk today about that sense of vision. The third step is the transduction, right? The sensory receptors translate the physical stimulus into a neural signal. Those neural signals go from the physical environment through your organ, your sensory receptor, in this example is your eyes, and then finally into your brain where it becomes the perception part of the puzzle. The neural signals travel along the nerve fibers to the thalamus. The cortical areas of the brain process the signals and construct a representation of a green light. The brain interprets the light as indicating start driving. If you remember, the thalamus is the sensory switchboard for all senses except, I hope you're all saying to yourself, smell, but all of those neural signals go through the thalamus before they go to their appropriate part of the brain. For this example, with it being vision, of course, it will go from the thalamus to the occipital lobe. Making sense of the world. We look at that process of the neural representation from the environment to sensation, transduction, perception in 2 different ways. The first is called bottoms-up processing, taking sensory information and assembling it and integrating it, kind of labeling it and coding it into your brain depending on where it's going. The second part is called top-down processing, using models, ideas, and expectations to interpret that sensory information. For example, your brain always looks at something and says, is this something I've seen before? Is this something I've experienced, encountered before? And how can I use that past experience to understand or interpret this new information? This goes a lot, to me, models a little bit, and we talked about working memory, how we take in that information for the first time and we use things from long-term memory. We bring it forward. along with our sensory memory, right? The same thing is going on in this top-down processing. You encounter something new in your environment, and your brain automatically wants to be able to make sense of it, to be able to understand it. If it doesn't at first, it's going to go back to what it already knows. This is what we call top-down processing. These next few slides are all examples of how your brain uses top-down processing in order to interpret information in your environment. If you were to look at these letters and I asked you, what does this say? Most people would try to read it and say, well, it says the man. Actually, it does not say the man, right? It says THEMHN. However, your brain, in interpreting the H of the, THE, then looks at the MAN, and even though it looks like an H, the same H that was in the word the, your brain doesn't have any reason to interpret MHN as a word. So it says, well, that H could also be interpreted as an A. It makes more sense for it to be the man rather than the MHN. So when I ask you to read these words, your brain says it says the man, because in your experience, in your top-down processing, your brain is trying to examine these letters and make them into words and to make them something that you've already seen or you have experience with before. We call this context effects. Looking at the sensory information, your brain processing it and using that top-down processing in order to make sense of it, depending on what you already know or what you already have in your experience. This is another one. You've probably seen this on the internet many times before. If I asked you to read this passage, if you were just to kind of look at the figures that are on here, it should be a bunch of gibberish, right? It's a combination of letters and numbers. How can you read letters and numbers? But if you start at the top and say to yourself, okay, well, she wants me to read this, you might try to actually make sense of these letters and numbers together. This message serves to prove how our minds can do amazing things, impressive things. In the beginning it was hard, but now on this line, your mind is reading it automatically without even thinking about it. How do we do that? Well, if we look at the first couple of figures, 7H15 should not be a word at all, but I've told you to read it. So your brain automatically goes into the mode of trying to find words that you know. It says that even though I know that that's a 7, that 7 kind of looks like a T, right? The 1 kind of looks like an I, and the 5 kind of looks like an S. So I'm going to interpret that as this, THIS, instead of 7H15. This is top-down processing, taking information, trying to understand what in your past could help you to interpret this new sensory information. This next one is a really interesting one. This is a very famous experiment that has been done many times in psychology. Adults, usually ages 18 and over, are shown this picture of a bottle, and they're asked to tell, what do you see on this bottle? 99.9% of adults will report that on this bottle they see the shadow of a man and a woman in kind of an intimate embrace, right? The woman doesn't have any clothes on, the man is standing behind her with his arms wrapped around her. That's absolutely what most people will report. Their top-down processing interprets that visual information, right? And it gives a response of something that is in their prior experience or something they've been exposed to before. When in the experiment, when they take this exact same picture and they show it to children, primarily between the ages of 5 and 8, the children have a much different answer. The children see dolphins. Do you see them now that I've circled them? There are a couple at the top. There are even a couple that aren't even circled. Down at the bottom, there's a tiny little baby on the top. There's 2 at the sides. Why do you think the kids see the dolphins and not the man and the woman in the loving embrace? Well, again, it goes back to top-down processing. Hopefully, children between the ages of 5 and 8 have never encountered any experience of a man and a woman in that kind of situation. So they don't have any prior experience to interpret the visual information in that context. To them, they see the dolphins. Now, if you look at that picture, probably all you see is the dolphins, and it's a little bit more difficult to pick out the man and the woman in there when you're focusing on the dolphins. Again, that's top-down processing. The children don't see the man and the woman, they see the dolphins because that's what is in their prior experience. Another important element of our sensation, transduction, perception equation of when these stimulus energies in your environment are coming into your sensory systems and being detected by the brain is that we need to talk about thresholds. Your brain is being bombarded by tons and tons of sensory information every single second that you're alive, and your brain has a really tough job that it has to make a decision of what's important for you to respond to and what's not important, what needs to be interpreted and organized and recognized, and what goes without your noticing it. And this goes into understanding what we call the absolute threshold. Absolute threshold is the minimum level of stimulus intensity needed to detect a stimulus more than half of the time. So of all these stimulus energies that are coming into the brain, your brain makes this decision: is this something that I need to attend to? Is it something that is at an intensity enough for me to be able to take it in and to understand it? Anything below that threshold is considered to be what we call subliminal. There's a really interesting area of psychology called subliminal advertising, where advertisers use sensory information that is below this threshold. There are some really cool experiments that were done that look at how advertisers use subliminal information to give us information that's below that absolute threshold. A famous one was done back in the 1950s, where there was a movie theater owner who decided that he wanted to increase his concession sales. So after every so many hundredths of frame of the movie, he would really quickly flash drink Coca-Cola. And he saw, after he did this, that his concession sales skyrocketed, that people didn't even realize that this frame was in the movie, but they were subliminally getting that information and increased his sales of Coca-Cola. Advertisers use this all the time in our environment now. If you go into certain stores, they'll use smell, they'll use sounds to get you to focus your attention, even though you don't recognize it or realize it, to certain products rather than others. The absolute threshold is the amount of stimulus that's detected for each sense. You do not need to know these for your test individually, how much it is. But for taste, for example, it's 1 teaspoon of sugar in 2 gallons of water. If it were less than a teaspoon, you probably would not be able to taste a difference, but if it's a teaspoon or more, you should be able to taste a difference. So these are just some examples for each of the different senses of how we reach that absolute threshold. Again, this is for the average person who doesn't have any impairments in any of their senses. The difference threshold is the minimum difference in either color, pitch, weight, temperature, whatever sense you're talking about, for a person to be able to detect that difference half the time. Weber's law is the official measurement of that. It refers to the principle that for two stimuli to be perceived as different, they must differ by a minimum percentage, and that's usually 2% of weight, 8% of light intensity, and 0.3% of sound wave frequency to notice a difference in pitch. The first sense that we're going to talk about is vision or sight. In the videos folder for this week, I've posted a couple of great videos for this chapter, but there is one from your textbook on the sense of vision and how these systems work. How do we see? Every time you open your eyes, nearly half of your brain springs into action. As you remember from the earlier slide when we talked about sensation, transduction, perception, and that used sight as an example, once those neural impulses go through the optic nerve into the thalamus and then to your occipital lobe of your brain, it then can travel to many different areas of the brain to help you to interpret and to understand and to respond to what your sensory organ of your eyes is taking in. Sensory receptors in your eyes detect light. This is basically the process of what happens when you are taking in information from your environment and then interpreting it. First, light waves come in and enter the eye through your environment. Those light waves pass through the cornea. The cornea is a thick, transparent outer layer of your eyeball. The light then passes through the pupil. Remember, the pupil is the tiny little black dark circle in the center of your eye. The iris, the circular muscle, gives your eyes their color and controls the pupil size to determine how much light enters the eye. When people talk about their pupils dilating, they're talking about that muscle of the iris that actually is contracting around the pupil, which controls how much of that pupil you see. Behind the iris, muscles change the shape of the lens, the adjustable, transparent structure behind the pupil. This focuses light into the retina, which results hopefully in a crisp visual image. The retina is located in the back of the eyeball. Here is a very nice diagram of the eye. You will not be asked to diagram this or anything on your test, but you should definitely know the parts of the eye and their job. Here the light waves are coming in into the eye. The cornea, again here in the front, bends the light waves so that the image can be focused on the retina. The iris, remember, is the colored part of your eye, the muscles that control the size of the pupil. The pupil is the little black dot in the center, the opening that changes size depending on the amount of light in the environment. The lens is in the middle. It changes shape to bring objects into focus. And then those light waves are directed to the back of the eye, where into the retina, which contains all of your photoreceptor cells. The information from those cells goes into your optic nerve. If you remember way back in chapter 2, when we watched our video, remember the gross video, the unfixed brain, and she flips the brain over and we looked at the optic nerve and the optic chiasm? This is what we're talking about. They come from the organ of the eyeballs, and the optic nerve is what sends those signals into the brain. When we look at these individual light waves that enter the eye, we perceive the wavelength and frequency of the electromagnetic waves as color or hue. You can see very short wavelengths have bluish colors and very long wavelengths have reddish colors. And we perceive height and amplitude of these waves as intensity or brightness. Rods and cones. So as that light wave enters the eye, and like I said, is directed into the back of the retina has two different types of receptor cells, rods and cones. Rods help us to see black and white actions in our peripheral view and in the dark, and cones help us to see sharp, colorful details in bright light. You know me, I always have things that help me to remember. I always remember C for color, C for cones. That rods are black and white, cones are color. They both begin with C. You definitely need to know the definitions for both rods and cones, what they do, and you also need to know this chart, how many of each of those are and where they're located in the retina. You can see we have many, many more rods than we do have cones in each eyeball. Only about 6 million cones, but 120 million rods. The cones are located in the center of the retina. Remember, C for cones, C for color, C for center of the retina, whereas the rods are located on the periphery, which makes sense. They're located on the periphery because the rods also help us to understand our peripheral vision and what's in our peripheral views. Sensitivity in dim light is low for cones, high for rods. Color sensitivity, of course, C for color, C for cones, is high in cones, low for rods, and detail is high for cones, low for rods as well. When we talk about cones and our C for color, C for cones. There are 3 types of color receptor cones: red, green, and blue. Every other single color that you perceive in your environment is a result of light waves stimulating combinations of these cones. You only have 3 different types of cones: red, green, and blue. That's the Young-Helmholtz trichromatic, or what we call the 3-color theory. Some of you might be colorblind. Some people are born missing red cones or green cones, and they might have trouble differentiating red from green. These are circles with numbers in the middle. If you can't read those numbers in the middle, you might have a problem with color blindness. Opponent process theory refers to the neural process of perceiving white as the opposite of black, yellow as the opposite of blue, and red as the opposite of green. So in the absence of white, you will perceive black. In the absence of yellow, you will perceive blue. In the absence of red, you will perceive green, and vice versa. So the next slide I'm going to show is a great example of this. What I want you to do, there's going to be a picture on the screen, and I want you to not look at the picture. I only want you to look at the black dot in the center of the picture. Stare at that black dot over and over and over again. Don't look away from the screen. Okay. Stare at the black dot in the center. Don't look anywhere else. Keep looking at the black dot. Look at the black dot. Keep looking at the black dot. Don't look away. Look at the black dot. Keep looking at the black dot. Look at the black dot. As I switched to the new screen, you should have seen a flash of a flag, right? This demonstrates opponent process theory. What you saw as green, you should have saw a flash of red. What you saw as black, you should have seen as a flash of white. And what you saw as yellow, you should have seen as a flash of blue. This next one is one of my favorite optical illusions. I'll be posting a web link in this week's folder for a website called brainden.com. Totally optional if you want to check it out. If you're like me and you like optical illusions, it's really a lot of fun. It's got a lot of great different types of optical illusions and some explanation of how they work and why your eyes see what they do. In this picture, I want you to stare at the picture of the girl, especially the 3 dots on her nose. I only want you to look at the 3 dots on her nose. Don't look anywhere else. Continue to look at those 3 dots on her nose as you listen to my voice, and I'm going to tell you what I want you to do next. So keep looking at the 3 dots, but when I tell you, not now, when I tell you, I want you to look at the white blank space on the screen next to the picture. And when you're looking at that, I want you to quickly blink your eyes really, really quickly. So continue to look at the 3 dots, continue to look at the 3 dots, look at the 3 dots. Now look at the white space and blink your eyes really quickly. You should see the same image of this girl, but in color. That works because even though this looks like a black and white picture, it does have hues of color that are below that absolute threshold that we talked about. As you're staring at the red, blue, and green dots on her nose, your eye is taking those and then detecting and searching for hues of those colors. When you look at the white and you blink your eyes, it brings those that image into view. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about audition. Audition is your sense of hearing. This is another chapter where we usually have a lot of really interesting and fun experiments that we do in a seated class that are a little bit more challenging to do online. So in this week's folder, I have some neat experiments, some neat videos that you can check out if you're interested. They are totally optional as well. Just as our sense of vision is stimulated by light waves in our environment entering into our eye, our sense of audition or hearing is stimulated by sound waves that are in our environment that enter into our ear. We analyze these waves on 3 different levels, through frequency, amplitude, and complexity. Frequency corresponds to our perception of what we call pitch. The length of the sound wave is either high or low, that's the pitch. Low frequency waves are low pitch sounds, high frequency waves are high pitch sounds. Amplitude corresponds to your perception of loudness or volume, being either a soft volume or a very loud volume. High amplitude waves are very loud sounds. Low amplitude waves are very soft sounds. And finally, complexity. Complexity corresponds to your perception of timbre or tone. We sometimes call this sound quality or the resonance of a tone. A simple wave is a pure tone, and a complex combination of waves is a mix of different frequencies. This is a diagram of the ear. Just like the diagram we have of the eye, you won't need to label this on a test, but you do need to make sure that you know the different parts of the ear and the function of each of those parts. We divide the ear into three specific sections: the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. The outer ear is your ear itself, the actual organ that collects the sound waves from the environment and funnels them down towards the eardrum. The middle ear, the sound waves hit the eardrum and move toward three very important parts: the hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup. Those three little tiny bones vibrate, and they amplify the sound waves and send a signal of those vibrations to the next part of the ear in the inner ear called the cochlea. In the inner ear, waves of fluid move from the oval window over the cochlea's hair receptor cells. So the cochlea is shaped kind of like a seashell, and on the inside of the cochlea are these hair receptor cells called stereocilia. There's fluid inside of the cochlea, and those hair cells move back and forth in waves that help to transmit the signal then to the auditory nerve, which then goes, remember, to the thalamus and then to the temporal lobe of the brain. This is a close-up cochlea. As you can see, it is shaped in a spiral shape, kind of like a seashell, and you can see the hair cells that line the cochlea. These cochlea move in that fluid, and when very loud sounds come through the ear, it makes a very quick vibration in the middle ear that is transmitted into the cochlea, and super loud sounds can cause damage to these hair cells. Once the hair cells are damaged, they're dead, they're gone. They won't ever come back. So we have to be very careful with the volume of some of the sounds in our environment to make sure that they don't damage the cochlea in the inner ear. There are two main types of hearing loss that we as human beings experience. Conduction hearing loss happens when the middle ear isn't conducting sound well to the cochlea. And then we have sensory neural hearing loss, when the receptor cells aren't sending messages through to the auditory nerves. As you can see in this close-up, again, you can see those little hairs. The vibrations come from the middle ear. The stirrup sends it into the vibrations from the stirrup sends it into the cochlea. The hair cells then move, and then it sends it to the nerve fibers in the auditory nerve, which then goes to the thalamus and then to the temporal lobe of your brain. In this diagram, you can see how different decibels of sound affect your hearing. Prolonged exposure above 85 decibels produces hearing loss. You can see normal conversation is usually at about 60 decibels. And again, that is the amplification of those sound waves. Subway train at 20 feet, 100, jet plane, 110, loud thunder, 120. Being at close range at a concert is 140 decibels. I don't know if you've ever sat front row at a concert, but usually when you leave that concert, your ears are ringing, everything sounds kind of fuzzy. You've kind of stunned and perhaps damaged some of the hair cells in your cochlea, which could then could produce hearing loss in the future. In this week's folder, I have included a couple of videos that are clips of different experiences with hearing. There's a video from your textbook, again, just like the one for vision, on audition, that explains, again, this whole process of hearing. But I've also included a link to a YouTube video that has sounds that adults can't hear. And if you play this, if you are younger, will be able to hear this very loud pitch sound. If you take that around your parents or somebody who's usually over 40 years old, they won't be able to hear the noise that's emitted from that video. And that's usually because through regular human development, we start to lose our hearing at about 30 years old. Our hearing starts to decrease, and most adults cannot hear those sounds that are in that video. Our last sense that we're going to cover is taste. What happens when we taste food? Receptors in your taste buds detect chemical molecules. There are two important parts of our sense of taste contained on the tongue. Taste buds are structures that are located in what we call papillae on the tongue that contain sensory receptors. Those papillae include the groupings of the different taste buds. The taste information is sent to other brain regions through a set of nerves, primarily your facial nerve, and then after it goes through those nerves, again, it goes through our sensory switchboard, which is our thalamus, and then to your primary gustatory cortex in your brain. Here are how those receptors in your taste buds detect the chemical molecules. Of course, first, there's a physical stimulus. In this example, they're using a lemon. It combines with the saliva on your tongue. It produces the sensation of that taste. The molecules stimulate sensory receptors called taste receptors. The taste receptors are located in the taste buds that are grouped within the papillae. So the papillae contain the taste buds. The transduction again happens when it's when that sensation is transformed into a message that goes to the brain, and then it's perceived in your brain. The neurochemistry of taste. Contrary to popular belief, there aren't specific regions of the tongue that have only specific taste. They're kind of spread out throughout the tongue, concentrated more heavily in certain areas than others. But these receptors reproduce about every week or two. As we get older and through normal human development, our taste buds become less sensitive and they become less numerous as well. We have 5 different receptors for different types of taste. In psychology, we look at the origins of these types of tastes and why we have them. What survival or evolutionary function did they have for us as human beings? We have sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. For your exam, make sure you know these 5 types of tastes and make sure you know the evolutionary or survival function that each one contributed to our evolution. Sweet taste is for us to be able to locate energy sources. Sour and bitter were both protective mechanisms, sour for potentially toxic acids and bitter for other poisons. Salty was for sodium, essential for physiological processes. And the last one is the newest kind of buzzword called umami. I watch a lot of Food Network. I like a lot of food TV shows. And about 10 or 15 years ago, you never heard the word umami. We would just say savory. Now they say umami. These are proteins to grow and repair tissue in your body. Our last section of this chapter, I just wanted to touch on synesthesia. We will talk about synesthesia several times throughout the semester. We're going to watch a great video when we get to our chapter on memory about this gentleman who has one of the best memories recorded in the world, and he also happens to have synesthesia. Synesthesia is basically the crossing of the senses. Sensory interaction occurs when different senses influence each other, and synesthesia is a condition when perception in one sense is triggered by sensation in a different sense. This is an incredibly interesting phenomena in psychology, where people will experience the combination of 2 senses together. For example, some people might see different numbers as colors in their brain. There are some people who experience music as color. I've posted several really good videos that I encourage you to watch in the video folder this week about synesthesia. One is just explaining synesthesia. One is of a girl who has what we call number synesthesia, where she relates, like I said, colors with numbers. And then there's another one of a man who has a very rare form of synesthesia where he actually tastes words. So he'll hear a certain word and he'll get a specific taste in his mouth. By far the most common type of synesthesia, and there are many other different types, these are just four. The most common, by far, is grapheme color, and that's where people associate certain numbers or even letters with colors in their brain. The girl in the video I was telling you about does a great job of explaining what this is like. The second is sound to color. There are a lot of very famous musicians, Lady Gaga, Billy Joel. I even heard that Billie Eilish as well has sound to color synesthesia, where these people can hear a note, and while hearing that note they see a certain color in their brain. There's personification, where people attribute certain personality traits to words or numbers. And then the last one is by far the most rare that I was telling you about, that gentleman in the video, called lexical gustatory, where people have a crossing of hearing certain words and then having certain tastes in their mouth. For example, the guy in the video, I think he might hear, let's say, the word pencil, and he might taste broccoli in his mouth. He might hear the word flour, and he might taste popcorn in his mouth. So there's a crossing of those senses with synesthesia. Very interesting phenomena. I hope you take the time to watch those videos.